George's Marvelous Medicine will be the book I will read in ASMR style for you today. So listen carefully to Rohald Dahl's story. RSMR Katz. Hello, my little mouse. It is a new day full of an ASMR book, and this time I will read for you George's Marvelous Medicine from Rohald Dahl. I already started and read a lot of books from this collection. So if you are into Rohald Dahl books or you want to wish to see more ASMR book stories, then feel free to click yourself through my YouTube account. My name is ASMR Katz, and I'm a heavily tattooed red girl who show you the satisfaction of sound. And sound is not just about reading books. It can be everything. So if you are open-minded to explore ASMR, feel free and click yourself through everything what I have to offer. Like, subscribe, click on the notification bell and comment if you have some thoughts in mind you want to share with me. Every support is absolutely welcome because I love to show you way more from my little world. George's Marvelous Medicine. The rule would be this: whatever he saw, if it was runny or powdery or gooey, it went in. So let us see what this book have to offer. And when you ask yourself why I have the headphones laying on the floor, it is because this is a high quality recording. So if you want the best of sound satisfaction, put your headphones in as well. Lean back, make yourself comfortable, and enjoy this book together with me. And I can tell you, it have an amazing effect. It have even amazing effect on me. Sometimes I'm tired from reading and I'm yawning. It is so nice because ASMR just calms you down and relax your body and soul. Rohald Dahl was a spy, ace fighter pilot, chocolate historian, and medical inventor. He was also the author of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Matilda, the BFG, and many more brilliant stories. He remains the world's #1 storyteller. Quentin Blake has illustrated more than 300 books and was Roald Dahl's favorite illustrator. In 1980, he won the Prestige Gate Greenway Medal. In 1999, he became the first ever children's laureate, and in 2013, he was knighted for a service to illustration. Introduced George Cranky, Mr. Killy Cranky, Miss Cranky, and Grandma. The book is for doctors everywhere. Warning to the readers: do not try to make George's Marvelous Medicine yourself at home. It could be dangerous. Grandma. I'm going shopping in the village, George's mother said to George on Saturday morning. So be a good boy and don't get up my fish sheaf. This was a silly thing to say to a small boy at any time. It immediately made him wonder what sort of mischief he might get up to. And don't forget to give Grandma her medicine at 11 o'clock, the mother said. Then out she went, closing the back door behind her. Grandma, who was dozing in her chair by the window, opened a wicked later eye and said, Now, You heard what your mother said, George. Don't forget my medicine. No, Grandma, George said, and just try to behave yourself for once. She is away. Yes, Grandma, George said. George was bored to tears. He didn't have a brother or a sister. His father was a farmer, and the farm they lived on was miles away from anywhere. So there were never any children to play with. He was tired of staring at pigs and hens and cows and sheep. He was especially tired of having to live in the same house as the grisly old Grunion of Grandma. Looking after her all by himself was hardly the most exciting way to spend a Saturday morning. You can make me a nice cup of tea for a start, Grandma said to George. That will keep you out of mischief for a few minutes. Yes, Grandma, George said. George couldn't help disliking Grandma. She was a selfish, grumpy old woman. She had pale brown teeth and a small bucket-up mouth like a dog's bottom. How much sugar in your tea today, Grandma? George asked her. 1 spoon, she said, and no milk. Most grandmothers are lovely, kind, helpful old ladies, but not this one. She spent all day and every day sitting in her chair by the window, and she was always complaining, grousing, grouching, grumbling, gripping about something or other. Never once, even on her best days, had she smiled at George and said, "Well, how are you this morning, George?" Or, "Why don't you have a game of snakes and ladders?" Or, "How was school today?" She didn't seem to care about other people, only about herself. She was miserable old grunge. George went into the kitchen and made Grandma a cup of tea with a tea bag. He put on a spoon of sugar in it and no milk. He stirred the sugar well and carried the cup into the living room. Grandma sipped the tea. "It's not sweet enough," she said. "Put more sugar in." George took the cup back to the kitchen and added another spoonful of sugar. He stirred it again and carried it carefully to his grandma. "Where is the sour?" she said. "I want to have a cup without a sour." George fetched her a sour. "And what about a teaspoon, if you please?" "I've stirred it for you, Grandma." "I stirred it well." "I stir my own tea. Thank you very much," he said. "Fetch me a teaspoon." George fetched her a teaspoon. When George's mother or father were home, Grandma never ordered George about like this. It was only when she had him on her own that she began treating him badly. "You know what's the matter with you," the old woman said, staring at George over the rim of the teacup with those bright, wicked little eyes. "You are growing too fast." Boy, who grew too fast became stupid and lazy. "But I can't help it if I'm growing fast, Grandma," George said. "Of course you can," she snapped. "Growing is a nasty, childish habit. But we have to grow, Grandma. If we don't grow, we'd never be grown-ups." "Rubbish, boy, just rubbish," she said, looked at me. "Am I grown?" "Certainly not. But you did once, Grandma. Only very little." The old woman answered. "I gave up growing when I was extremely small, along with all the other nasty childish habits like laziness and disobedience and greed and sloppiness and unattentiveness and stupidity. You haven't given up any of these things, have you?" "I'm still only a little boy, Grandma." "You're 8 years old," she snorted. "That's old enough to know better. If you don't stop growing soon, it will be too late." "Too late for what, Grandma?" It's ridiculous, she went on. You are nearly as tall as me already. George took a good look at Grandma. She certainly was a very tiny person. Her legs were so short she had to have footstool to put her feet on, and her head only came halfway up the back of the archmere. Daddy says it's fine for a man to be tall, George said. Don't listen to your daddy, Grandma said. Listen to me. But how do I stop myself growing? George asked. Eat less chocolate, Grandmother said. Does chocolate make you grow? It makes you grow the wrong way, she snapped. Up instead of down. Grandma sipped some tea, but never took her eyes from the little boy who stood before her. Never grow up, she said. Always down. Yes, Grandma. And stop eating chocolate. Eat cabbage instead. Cabbage? Oh no, I don't like cabbage, George said. It's not what you like or what you don't like, Grandmother snapped. It's what's good for you that counts. From now on, you must eat cabbage 3 times a day. Mountains of cabbage. And if it's good caterpillars in it, so much the better, said George. Caterpillars give you brains, the old woman said. Money, wash them down the sink, George said. Mummies are stupid as you are, Grandma said. Cabbage doesn't taste of anything without a few boiled caterpillars in it. Not sludges. George cried out. I couldn't eat sludges. Whenever I see a live sludge on a piece of lettuce, Grandma said, I gobble it up quickly before it crawls away. Delicious. She squeezed her lips together tight so that her mouth became a tiny wrinkled hole. Delicious, she said again. Worms and slugs and beetly bugs. You don't know what's good for you. You are joking, Grandma. I never joke, she said. Beetles are perhaps the best of all. They go crunchy. Sorry. Grandma, that's beastly. The old hag grinned showing those pale brown teeth. Sometimes, if you are lucky, she said, you get a battle inside the stem of a stick of celery. That's what I like. Grandma, how could you? You find all sorts of nice things in sticks of raw celery, the old woman went on. Sometimes it's earwigs. I don't want to hear about it, cried George. A big fat earwig is very tasty, Grandma said, licking her lips. But you got to be very quick, my dear. When you put one of those in your mouth, it has a pair of sharp nippers on its pig's end, and if it grabs your tongue with those, it never lets go. So you got to do a bite the earwig first. Chop, chop, before it bites you. George started edging towards the door. He wanted to get as far away as possible from this filthy old woman. You're trying to get away from me, aren't you? She said, pointing a finger straight to George's face. You're trying to get away from Grandma. Little George stood by the door staring at the old hag in the chair. She started back at him. Could it be, George wondered, that she was a witch? He had always thought witches were only in fairy tales, but now he was not so sure. Come closer to me, little boy, she said, beckoning to him with a horny finger. Come closer to me, and I will tell you the secrets. George didn't move. Grandma didn't move either. I know a great many secrets, she said, and suddenly she smiled. It was a thin, icy smile, the kind a snake might make just before it bites you. Come over here to Grandma, and she whispered secrets to you. George took a step backwards, adding closer to the door. You must be frightened of your old grandma, she said, smiling that icy smile. George took another step backwards. Some of us, she said, and all the ones she was leaning forward in her chair and whispering in a throaty sort of voice George had never heard used before. Some of us, she said, have magic powers that can twist the creatures of this earth into wondrous shapes. A tingle of electricity flashed down the length of George's spine. He began to feel frightened. Some of us, the old woman went on, have fire on tongues and sparks in our bellies and wizardry in the tips of your fingers. Some of us know secrets that would make your hair stand straight up on end and your eyes pop out at their sockets. George wanted to run away, but his feet seemed stuck to the floor. We know how to make your nails drop off and teeth grow out of your fingers instead. George began to tremble. It was her face that frightened him so much. The frosty smile, the brilliant unblinking eyes. We know how to have you wake up in the morning with a long tail coming out from behind you. Grandma, he cried. We know secrets, my dear, about dark places where dark things live and squirm and slither all over each other. George made a dive for the door. It doesn't matter how far you run. Her heart, he heard her saying, you won't ever get away. George ran into the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. The marvelous plan. George saw himself down at the table in the kitchen. He was shaking a little. Oh, how he hated Grandma. He really hated that horrid old witchy woman. And all of a sudden he had a tremendous urge to do something about her, something whopping, something absolutely terrific, a real shocker, a sort of explosion. He wanted to blow away the witchy smell that hung about her in the next room. He may have been only 8 years old, but he was a brave little boy. He was ready to take this old woman on. I'm not going to be frightened by her, he said softly to himself. But he was frightened, and that's why he wanted suddenly to explode her away. Well, not quite away, but he didn't want to shake the old woman up a bit. Very well then, what should it be, this whooping, terrifying, exploding shocker from Grandma? He would have liked to put a firework banger under her hair, but he didn't have one. He would have liked to put a long green snake down the back of her dress, but he didn't have a long green snake. He would like to have to put 6 black rats in the room with her and lock the door, but he didn't have 6 big black rats. As George sat there pondering this interesting problem, his eye fell upon the bottle of Grandma's brown medicine standing on the sideboard. Rotten stuff it seemed to be. 4 times a day, a large spoonful of it was swallowed into her mouth, and it didn't do her slightest bit of good. She was always just as horrid after she had it as she'd been before. The whole point of medicine surely was to make a person bitter. If it didn't do that, then it was quite useless. So, thought George suddenly, I know exactly what I will do. I shall make her new medicine, one that is strong and so fiercey and so fantastic, it will either cure her completely or blow off the top of her head. I will make her a magic medicine, a medicine no doctor in the world had ever met before. George looked at the kitchen clock. It said 10:05. There was nearly an hour left before grandmother's next dose was due at 11. "Here we got then," cried George, jumping up from the table. "A magic medicine it shall be. So give me a bug and jumping flea, give me 2 snails and lizards 3, and a slimy scriggler from the sea, and the poisonous sting of a bumblebee, and the juice from the fruit of the juju tree, and the powder bone of wombat's knee, and 100 other things as well, each with a rather nasty smell. I stir them up, I'll boil them long, I mix them through, I mix them strong, and then, hey ho, and down it goes, a nice big spoonful, hold your nose. Just gulp it down and have no fear. How do you like it, Granny dear? Will she go poop? Will she explode? Will she go flying down the road? Will she go poof in puff of smoke, start fizzling like a can of Coke? Who knows? Not I. Let's wait and see. I'm glad it's either you or me. Or, Grandma, if you only knew what I have got in store for you. George begins to make the medicine. George took an enormous saucepan out of the cupboard and placed it on the kitchen table. "George," came the shrill voice from the next room. "What are you doing?" "Nothing, Grandma," he called out. "You needn't think I can't hear you just because you closed the door. You are rattling the saucepans." "I'm just tidying the kitchen, Grandma." Then was silence. George had absolutely no doubts whatsoever about how he was going to make his famous medicine. He wasn't going to fool about wondering whether to put in a little bit of this or a little bit of that. Quite simply, he was going to put in everything he could find. There would be no messing about, no hesitating, no wondering whether a particular thing would knock the old girl sideways or not. The rule would be this: whatever he saw, if it was runny or powdery or gooey, in it went. Nobody had ever made a medicine like that before. If it didn't actually cure Grandma, then it would anyway cause something exciting results. It would be worth watching. George decided to work his way around the various rooms, one at a time, and see what they had to offer. He would go first to the bathroom. There are always a lot of funny things in a bathroom. So upstairs he went, carrying the enormous 2-handled saucepan before him. In the bathroom, he gazed longingly at the famous and dreaded medicine cupboard, but didn't go near it. It was the only thing in the entire house he was forbidden to touch. He had made solemn promises to his parents about this, and he was going to break them. There were things in there they had told him that could actually kill a person, and also he was out to give Grandma a pretty fiery mouthful. He didn't really want the dead body on his hands. George put the saucepan on the floor and went to work. Number 1 was a bottle labeled Golden Gloss Hair Shampoo. He emptied it into the pan. That ought to wash her tummy nice and clean, he said. He took the full tube of toothpaste and squeezed it out, the whole lot of it in a long warm. Maybe that will brighten up those horrid brown teeth of hers, he said. There was an aerosol can of superfoam shaving soap belonging to his father. George loved playing with aerosols. He pressed the button and kept his finger on it until there was nothing left. A wonderful mountain of white foam built up in the giant saucepan. With his fingers, he scooped out the contents of a jar of vitamin-enriched face cream. In went a small bottle of Skal nail varnish. "If the toothpaste doesn't clean her teeth," George said, "then this will paint them red as roses." He found another jar of creamy stuff labeled hair remover. "Smeared it on your legs," it said, "and allow to remain for 5 minutes." George tipped it all in the saucepan. There was a bottle with yellow stuff inside, it called Dishworth's famous dandruff cure. In it went. There was something called Brilliant for cleaning false teeth. It was a white powder. In that went too. He found another aerosol can. "Nevermore Ponking Diron spray guaranteed," it said, "to keep away unpleasant body smells for a while day." She could use plenty of that, George said as he spread the entire canful into the saucepan. Liquid paraffin, the next one was called. It was a big bottle. He hadn't the faintest idea what it did to you, but he poured in anyway. That he thought looking around him was about all from the bathroom. On his mother's dressing table in the bedroom, George found yet another lovely aerosol can. It was called Helga's Hair Set. Hold 12 inches away from the hair and spray it lightly. He squirted the whole lot into the saucepan. He did enjoy squirting those aerosols. Nasty little boy. There was a bottle of perfume called Flowers of Turnips. It smelled of old cheese. In it went. And in too went a large round box of powder. It was called Pink Plaster. There was a powder puff on the top, and he threw that in as well for luck. He found a couple of lipsticks. He pulled the grease red things out of their little cases and added them to the mixture. The bedroom had nothing more to offer, so George carried the enormous saucepan downstairs again and trotted into the laundry room, where the shelves were full of all kinds of household items. The first one he took down was a large box of super white for automatic washing machine. "Dirt," it said, "will disappear like magic." George didn't know whether Grandma was automatic or not, but she was certainly a dirty old woman. "So she better have it all," he said, tipping in the whole box full. Then there was a big tin of Waxwell floor polish. "It removes filth and false message from your floor and leaves everything shiny bright," it said. George scooped the orange-colored waxy stuff out of the tin and plonketed it into the pan. There was a round cardboard carton labeled "Flea powder for dogs. Keep well away from the dog food," it said, "because this powder, if eaten, will make the dog explode." "Good," said George, pouring it all into the saucepan. He found a box of canary seed on the shelf. "Perhaps it all make the old bird sing," he said, and it went. Next, George explored the box with shoe cleaning materials, brushed and tins and dusters. "Well now," he thought, "Grandma's medicine is brown, so medicine must also be brown or she smell like a rat." The way to color it, he decided, would be the brown shoe polish. The large tin he chose was labeled dark tan. Splendid. He scooped it all out with an old spoon and plopped it into the pan. He would stir it up later. On his way back to the kitchen, George saw a bottle of gin standing on the sideboard. Grandma was very fond of gin. She was allowed to have small nip of it every evening. Now he would give her a treat. He would pour in the whole bottle. He did. Back in the kitchen, George put the huge saucepan on the table and went over the cupboard that served as a larder. The shelves were bulging with bottles and jars of every sort. He chose the following and emptied them one by one into the saucepan. a tiny of curry powder, a tiny of mustard powder, a bottle of extra hot chili sauce, a tin of black pepperons, a bottle of horseradish sauce. There, he said all out. That should do it. George came to Screech's voice from the next room. Who are you talking to in there? What are you up to? Nothing, Grandma, absolutely nothing, he called back. It is time for my medicine yet. No, Grandma, not for about a half an hour. Well, just see you don't forget it. I won't, Grandma, George answered. I promise I won't. Animal pills. At this point, George suddenly had an extra good wheeze. Also, the medicine cupboard in the house was forbidden ground. What about the medicine his father's kept on the shelf in the shed next to the hen house? The animal medicines. What about those? Nobody had ever told him he mustn't touch them. Let's face it, George said to himself, hairspray and shaving cream and shoe polish are all very well, and they will no doubt cause some splendid explosions inside the old geezer. But what the magic mixture now needs is a touch of real stuff, real pills and real tonics, to give it a punch and a muscle. George picked up the heavy 3/4 full saucepan and carried it out of the back door. He crossed the farmyard and headed straight for the shed alongside the hen house. He knew his father wouldn't be there. He was out haymaking in one of the meadows. George entered the dusty old shed and put the saucepan on the bench. Then he looked up at the medicine shelf. There were 5 big bottles. 2 were full of pills, 2 were full of runny stuff, and 1 was full of powder. I use them all, George said. Grandma needs them. Boy, does she need them. The first bottle he took down contained an orange-colored powder. The label said, 4 chickens with full pets, hen grip, sore breaks, grammy legs, coccolits, egg trouble, broodiness or loss of feathers. Mix 1 spoonful only with each bucket of food. Well, George said aloud to himself as he tipped in the whole bottleful. The old bird won't be losing any feathers after she had a dose of this. The next bottle he took down had about 500 giant purple pills in it. For horses with hoarse throats, it said on the label. The hoarse-throated horse should suck on pill twice a day. Grandma may not have a horse that throat, George said, but she's certainly got a sharp tongue. Maybe they cure that inside. Into the saucepan went the 500 giant purple pills. Then there was a bottle of thick yellowish liquid. For cows, bulls and bullocks, the label said, will cure cowpox, cow mink, crumbled horns, bad breath in bulls, ear age, tooth age, head age, hoof age, tail age, and sore udders. That grumpy old cow in the living room has every one of those rotten illnesses, George said. She never at all. With a slop and gurk, the yellow liquid splashed into the now nearly full saucepan. The next bottle contained a brilliant red liquid. Sheep dip, it said on the label, for sheep with sheep rot and for getting rid of ticks and fleas. Mix 1 spoonful in a gallon of water and slosh it over the sheep. Caution. Do not make the mixture any stronger or the wool will fall out and the animal will be naked. By gum, said George, how I love to walk on a slosh it all over Grandma and watch the ticks and fleas go jumping off her. But I can't. I mustn't. So she will have to drink it instead. He poured the bright red medicine into the saucepan. The last bottle on the shelf was full of pale green pills. Pig pills, the label announced. For pigs, with pork prickles, tender trotters, Bristol blight, and swine sickness. Give 1 pill per day. In 7 cases, 2 pills may be given, but more than that will make the pig rock and roll. Just the stuff, said George, for that miserable old pig back in the house there. She'd need a very big dose. He tipped all the green pills, hundreds and hundreds of them, into the saucepan. There was an old stick lying on the bench that had been used for searing paint. George picked it up and started to stir his marvellous concoction. The mixture was as thick as cream, and as he stirred and stirred, many wonderful colors rose up from the depths and blended together: pink, blues, greens, yellows, and browns. George went on stirring until it was all mixed. But even so, there were still hundreds of pills lying on the bottom that hadn't melted. And there was his mother's splendid powder puff floating on the surface. I shall have to boil it all, George said. 1 good quick boil on the stove is all it needs. And with that he stragged back towards the house with the enormous heavy saucepan. On the way he passed the garage, so he went in to see if he could find another interesting thing. He added the following: half a pan of engine oil to keep Grandma's engine going smooth, some antifreeze to keep her radiator from freezing up in winter, a handful of grease to grease her cracking joints, and then back to the kitchen. The cook-up. In the kitchen, George put the saucepan on the stove and turned up the gas flame underneath it as high as it would go. "George," came the awful voice from the next room, "it's time for my medicine." "Not yet, Grandma," George called back. "There are still 20 minutes before 11 o'clock. "What mischief are you up to in there now?" Granny scratched her. "I hear noises." George thought it best not to answer this one. He found a long wooden spoon in the kitchen drawer and began stirring it hard. The stuff in the pot got hotter and hotter. Soon the marvellous mixture began to froth and foam. A rich blue smoke, the color of peacocks, rose from the surface of the liquid, and a fiery, fearsome smell filled the kitchen. It made George choke and splutter. It was a smell unlike any he had smelled before. It was a brutal and batch-wing smell, spicy and staggering, fiercey and frenzied, full of wizardry and magic. Whenever he got a whiff of it up his nose, firecrackers went off in his skulls and electric prickles ran along the backs of his leg. It was wonderful to stand there stirring this amazing mixture and to watch it smoking blue and bubbling in front of foam as thought it were alive. At one point, he could have sworn he saw bright sparkles flashing in the thrilling foam. And suddenly, George found himself dancing around the steaming pot, chanting strange words that came into his head out of nowhere. Fiery broth and witch's brew, foam froth and riches blue, fummy and spummy and spondrift spray, fizzle swizzle. Shout hooray. Watch it sloshing, washing, sploshing, hear it hissing, squishing, spicing. Grandma better start to pray. Brown paint. George turned off the heat under the saucepan. He must leave plenty of time for it to cool down. When all the steam and froth had gone away, he peered into the giant pan to see what color the great medicine now was. It was a deep and brilliant blue. "It needs more brown in it," George said. "It simply must be brown or Shaw'll get suspicious." George ran outside and dashed into his feathers tool shelf where all the paints were kept. There was a row of cans in the shelf, all colors: black, green, red, pink, white, and brown. He reached for the can of brown. The label said simple dark brown gloss paint on quart. He took a screwdriver and prizzed off the lid. The can was 13 quarters full. He rushed it back to the kitchen. He poured the whole lot into the saucepan. The saucepan was now full to the brim. Very gentle, George stirred at the paint into the mixture with a long wooden spoon. Ah, it was all turning brown, a lovely, rich, creamy brown. "Where is the medicine of my boy?" came the voice from the living room. "You're forgetting me. You're doing it on purpose. I shall tell your mother." "I'm not forgetting you, Grandma," George called back. "I'm thinking of you all the time, but there are still 10 minutes to go." "You are a nasty little maggot," the voice screeched back. "You are lazy and disappointment, little worm, and you're growing too fast." George fetched the bottle of Grandma's real medicine from the sideboard. He took out the cork and tipped it all down the sink. He then filled the bottle with his own magic mixture by dipping a small judge into the saucepan and using it as a pourer. He replaced the cork. Had it cooled down enough yet? Not quite. He held the bottle under the cold tap for a couple of minutes. The label came off in the wet, but that didn't matter. He dried the bottle with the dishcloth. All was now ready. This was it. The great moment had arrived. "Medicine time, Grandma," he called out. "I should hope so too," came the grumpy reply. The silver tablespoon in which the medicine was always given lay ready on the kitchen sideboard. George picked it up. Holding the spoon in one hand and the bottle in the other, he advanced into the living room. Grandma gets medicine. Oh. Grandma sat hunched in her chair by the window. The wicked little eyes followed George close as he crossed the room towards. "You are late," she snapped. "I don't think that I am, Grandma." "Don't interrupt me in the middle of a sentence," she shouted. "But you finished your sentence, Grandma." "There you go again," she cried, "always interrupting and arguing. You really are tiresome, little boy." "What's the time?" "It's exactly 11 o'clock, Grandma." "You're lying as usual. Stop talking so much and give me my medicine. Shake the bottle first, then pour it into a spoon and make sure it's a whole spoonful." "Are you going to gulp it all down in one go?" George asked her. "Or will you sip it?" "What I do is none of your business," the old woman said. "Fill the spoon." As George removed cork and began very slowly to pour the thick brown stuff into the spoon, he couldn't help thinking back upon all the mad and marvelous things that had gone into the making of his crazy stuff. The shaving soup, the hair remover, the dandruff cure, the automatic washing machine powder, the flea powder for dogs, the shoe polish, the black pepper, the horseradish sauce, and all the rest of them, not to mention two powerful animal pills and powders and liquids and the brown paint. "Open your mouth wide, Grandma," he said, "and I pop it in." The old hag opened her small wrinkled mouth, showing disgusting pale brown teeth. "Here we go," George cried out. "Swallow it down." He pushed the spoon well into her mouth and tipped the mixture down her throat. Then he stepped back to watch the result. It was worth watching. Grandma yelled, "Orr!" and her whole body shot whoosh in the air. It was exactly as thought. Someone had pushed an electric wire through the underneath of her chair and switched on the current. Up she went like a jig in the box, and she didn't come down. She stayed there, suspended in midair, about 2 feet up, still sitting in position, but rigid now. Frozen, quivering, the eyes bulging, the hair standing straight up on end. "Is something wrong, Grandma?" George asked her politely. "Are you all right?" Suspended up there in the space, the old girl was beyond speaking. The shock that George's marvelous mixture had given her must have been tremendous. You have thought she swallowed a red-hot poker, the way she took off from the chair. Then, down she came again with a plop, back into her seat. "Call the fire brigade," she shouted suddenly. "My stomach is on fire." "It's just the medicine, Grandma," George said. "It's good, strong stuff." "Fire," the old woman yelled. "Fire in the basement. Get a bucket. Man, these hoses. Do something, quick." "Cool it, Grandma," George said. But he got a bit of shock when he saw the smoke coming out of her mouth and out of her nostrils. Clouds of black smoke were coming out of her nose and blowing around the room. "By golly, you really are on fire," George said. "Of course I'm on fire," she yelled. "I'll be burned to a crisp. I'll be fried to a frizzle. I'll be boiled like a beetroot." George ran into the kitchen and came back with a jug of water. "Open your mouth, Grandma," he cried. He could hardly see her for the smoke, but he managed to pour a half jugful down her throat. A sizzling sound, the kind you get if you hold a hot frying pan under a cold tap, came up from the deep down in Grandma's stomach. The old hag bucked and sheet and snorted. She gasped and gurgled. Spouts of water came shouting off her, and the smoke cleared away. "The fire's out," George announced proudly. "You'll be all right now, Grandmother." "All right?" she yelled. "Who's all right? There is Jackie Jumbers in my tummy. There is squirrels in my belly. There's bangers in my bottom." She began bouncing up and down in the chair. Quite obviously, she was not very comfortable. "You find this doing you a lot of good, the medicine, Grandma," George said. "Good?" she screamed. "Doing me good? It's killing me." Then she began to bulk. She was swelling. She was puffing up all over. Someone was pumping her up. That's how it looked. Was she going to explode? Her face was turning from purple to green. But wait, she had a puncture somewhere. George could hear the hiss of escaping air. She stopped swelling. She was going down. She was slowly getting thinner again, shrink back and back, slowly to her shrivelly old self. "How things," Grandma said. No answer. Then a funny thing happened. Grandma's body gave a sudden sharp twist and a sudden sharp jerk, and she flipped herself clear out of the chair and it landed neatly on her 2 feet on the carpet. "Wow, that's terrific, Grandma," George cried. "You haven't stood up like this for years. Look at you. You are standing up all on your own and you're not even using a stick." Grandma didn't even hear him. The frozen pop-eyed look was back with her again now. She was miles away in another world. Marvelous medicine, George told himself. He found it fascinating to stand there and watching what it was doing to the old hag. What next, he wondered. He soon found out. Suddenly, she began to grow. It was quite slow at first, just a very gradual inch and upwards. Up, 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 inch by inch. getting taller and taller, about an inch every few seconds. And in the beginning, George didn't notice it. But when she had passed the 5'6" mark and was going on up towards being 6 feet tall, George gave a jump and shouted, "Hey, Grandma, you are growing. You are going up. Hang on, Grandma. You better stop now or you will be hitting the ceiling." But Grandma didn't stop. It was a truly fantastic sight, this ancient, scrawny old woman getting taller and taller, longer and longer, thinner and thinner, as thought she were a piece of elastic being pulled upwards by invisible hands. When the top of her head actually touched the ceiling, George thought she was bound to stop. But she didn't. There was a sort of scrunching noise, and bits of plaster and cement and came raining down. "Hadn't you better stop now, Grandma?" George said. Daddy's just had this whole room repainted, but there was no stopping her now. Soon her head and shoulders had completely disappeared through the ceiling, and she was still going. George dashed upstairs to his own bedroom, and there she was coming up through the floor like a mushroom. "Ooh," she shouted, finding her voice at last. "Hallelujah, here I come." "Belly on, Grandma," George said. "With a high nonny no on up we go," she shouted. "Just watch me grow." "This is my room," George said. "Look at the mess you're making." "Terrific medicine," she cried. "Give me some more." "She dotty as donut," George thought. "Come on, boy. Give me some more," she yelled, dished it out. "I'm slowing down." George was clutching the medicine bottle in one hand and the spoon in the other. He thought, why not? He poured out a second dose and popped it into her mouth. "Ooh," she screamed, and up she went again. Her feet were still on the floor downstairs in the living room, but her head was moving quickly towards the ceiling of the bedroom. "I'm on my way, boy," she called down to George. "Just watch me go." "That's the active about you, Grandma," George called. "And keep out of there. It's full of bugs and boggles." Crash. The old girl's head went through the ceiling and it thought it were butter. George stood in front of his bedroom gazing at the thimbles. There was a big hole in the floor and another ceiling, and it's sticking up like a post between the two most middle part of Grandma. Her legs were in the room below, her head in the attic. "I'm still going," came the old squishy voice from up above. "Give me another dose, my boy, and let's go through the roof." "No, Grandma, no," George called back. "You are busting up the whole house." "To heck with the house," she shouted. "I want some fresh air. I haven't been outside for 20 years. "My golly, she is going through the roof," George told himself. He ran downstairs. He rushed out of the back door into the yard. It would be simple awful, he thought, if she bashed up the roof as well. His father would be furious, and George get the blame. He had made the medicine. He had given her too much. "Don't come through the roof, Grandma," he prayed. "Please don't." I think I split this book in 2 pieces. So this was the first half of George Marvellous Medicine, written by Rohald Dahl. I think it is a very entertaining book. I can't wait to read the second part of it. And if you like what you listen to here, then feel free to follow and subscribe and click on the notification bell to get the message that the next episode is the second part of this book here. I am super overwhelmed and happy that you find your way to my channel. My name is Katz, and I'm a heavily tattooed girl who goes with you on the adventure of sound. If you had any questions or want to tell something, then feel free to write comments, because every support is necessary and absolutely welcome here to see the little ASMR community grow. So I hope that you will be the next time again here when I read the second part of the book, George's Marvelous Medicine. I wish you, no matter where you are right now in this world, a fantastic time, and I hope you are relaxed and you feel good, and we see us soon.